So, Gabe, you were actually in the room last night for the president's news conference. What was it like, and why did he decide to speak out last night?
Well, Jose, the president was very forceful there, as you said, and it seemed that he really wanted to take these reporters' questions. He took several of them before he walked off, and then he came back, as you said, to answer a question about the hostage negotiations in the Israel-Hamas war. So he definitely wanted to push back here. And according to several White House aides, they felt that it was imperative for the president to push back on some of the more damning allegations in the report. And some of Biden advisors also view this as some purely political allegations from the special counsel, Robert Hur. But, Jose, there weren't just allegations, as you said, about his memory. There were some allegations that the president put national security at risk. Now, I asked the president directly whether he shared classified information with his ghostwriter, as alleged in page 3 of the report. Take a listen to his response.
I did not share classified information. I did not share it.
With your ghostwriter?
With my ghostwriter, I did not. Guarantee you did not.
But the special counsel said it.
Well, no, he did not say that.
Okay.
He did not say that.
But, Mr. President,
let me answer your question. The fact of the matter is, what I didn't want repeated, I didn't want him to know, and I didn't read it to him, was I had written a long memorandum to President Obama why we should not be in Afghanistan. It was not classified information in that document. That was not classified.
So the president, in that answer, also referred to that information that he spoke with his ghostwriter as perhaps private information. But again, he did not consider it to be classified information. However, Jose, that directly contradicts page 3 of the report. Again, White House officials and Biden advisors say that the allegations about the president's memory were, quote, gratuitous and way out of line. Jose.
And Ken, you have new reporting about why the special counsel included these passages about the president's memory in the report.
Yes, and I think what you just heard is a great example because Mr. Biden's recollection is just incorrect. The special counsel clearly says in the report that he shared classified information with the ghostwriter, and they document and they have evidence of it. So what I'm told by Justice Department officials is that special counsel Hur, he was writing a report that is required under the regulations to the Attorney General, explaining why he wasn't filing criminal charges against Mr. Biden, despite the significant evidence that he found that Mr. Biden willfully retained classified information, which is a crime. So in other words, this wasn't an accident. He took documents related in particular to the Afghanistan surge in 2009 that were highly classified. He took them home. And then in 2017, he was recorded on tape saying, I just found a bunch of classified documents, and he didn't report that to the FBI. Now, he said the reason for that is he quickly forgot about it. And Mr. Hur had to explain why there was some credence to that. There's a context here. And in doing that, he explained Mr. Biden's recent history of memory lapses and significant memory issues that he observed in his 5-hour interview with the president over the course of 2 days. And so that's why, according to the Justice Department, Hur put that stuff in there. And the reason it's public is because Attorney General Merrick Garland has promised to make every special counsel report, and there are 4 under his tenure, every one of them public, in response to what Bill Barr did when he was Attorney General, when he took the Mueller report, didn't release it, mischaracterized it in the view of some people, and got pilloried for that. So Garland does not want to make that mistake. He wants to put it all out there, Jose.
And Michael, you're familiar with an investigation like this from your time as an independent counsel. What's your take on this report?
Well, I think that Hur was trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, he's writing to the Attorney General saying, look, there's evidence of willfulness, but there are extenuating circumstances. I just don't think he needed to be as explicit in a report that he knew would go public in this election season. So, there are Justice Department policies about not interfering with elections. I sort of think that this crossed over the line, knowing that this was the single most important issue for Biden's re-election chances, his mental acuity. To put this stuff in there, yes, Ken is absolutely right. It was for context, but I think it should have been that he believed that a jury would be sympathetic to Mr. Biden and that they wouldn't prevail at trial, and that would violate DOJ policy, which is to say you must be able to convince a jury that you can convict, and that conviction has to be sustained on appeal before you indict. So I just think it was a step too far on Hur's part.
So, Michael, so in a way, essentially, you're saying that that politics needs to be taken into consideration, the timing of what these allegations and this report, knowing full well that we're in the campaign season, that politics should have played a part in what the special counsel said or didn't say?
Yeah, he would have been, Biden, in one sense, almost would have been better off if he were indicted. Then he would have had a courtroom opportunity to defend his memory and himself. Now he has this headline out there that he's of frail mental capacities, and he has no real forum within which to prove it otherwise. Hur has said, look, I don't think a jury would convict because I think a jury would be sympathetic to him. Well, he's putting himself in the mind of a jury. If Jack Smith wrote a report saying, I didn't charge Donald Trump with fraud because I believe his witnesses would lie, and because he's paying for all their attorney's fees, I don't think I could sustain a conviction. But I think they're all going to lie. Would that be an acceptable report? He's putting himself in the mind of the jurors. I don't think he can do that. I think he has to be much more clinical. When I wrote my report in the investigation of George H.W. Bush, we didn't try to psychoanalyze what a jury might do. We just said, these are the facts, and we can't bring an indictment because there's nothing that is warranted to bring an indictment. End of the case. And that's all Hur needed to do. He didn't need 400 pages of psychoanalysis of prospective jurors.
Such an interesting perspective you're giving us this morning. I very much appreciate it. Now, Ken, what are the differences, and there is vast differences between President Biden's handling of classified information and former President Trump's handling of classified information?
Jose, these cases are not even in the same universe. And Rob Hur, who is a lifelong Republican and was a appointee in the Trump Justice Department, made a point of enumerating those differences because, again, his audience here are Republicans in Congress as well who are going to criticize him for not charging Biden while Trump is charged for similar conduct. But what Hur said is it's not similar conduct because Mr. Biden is not accused of trying to hide documents or withhold evidence or refuse requests from the government to return classified documents, and he's not accused of obstructing justice, whereas Mr. Trump is accused of all those things, including ordering subordinates to destroy evidence and then lie about it, and he's charged in a 41-count indictment in that respect. So Rob Hur said it in his report, and anyone can make their own judgment. These cases are not the same at all, Jose.
And Gabe, meanwhile, the latest NBC News national poll finds that just over 3/4 of voters, including half of Democrats, say they have concerns about the president's mental and physical health. How does the White House plan to address these concerns?
Well, Jose, the White House is pushing back hard on that. Even a couple of days ago, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked about concerns about the president's age and mental fitness because there have been a couple of times where he had confused recently the names of world leaders. And in fact, he did that last night, confusing the presidents of Mexico and Egypt. The press secretary came back and said, look, people misspeak. It is normal for people to misspeak. And she really brushed off those concerns. And indeed, Jose, when I speak with Biden advisors and a source close to the campaign, they see these as GOP attacks about his age that are nothing new. And they transition to saying that, look, when it comes to the campaign, they feel that voters will not end up caring about that they will want to focus on other issues, for example, threats to democracy and reproductive rights, and also the improving economy. So they do not see that age, the concerns about the president's age, as really making a difference in the coming months in the 2024 campaign. Of course, it will be a challenge, though, as Republicans really plan to seize on this issue, Jose.
Ken Dilanian, Gabe, Gutierrez, and Michael Zeldin, thank you so very much.